In our third lecture on Congress, we are going to learn about some of its non-legislative tasks. We think about the legislative branch as the lawmaking branch of government, and it is, but it has important tasks aside from making and passing bills to go to the president to become law. One of those that we've already seen here and there is the advice and consent task of Congress, and specifically the Senate. The Senate is the only house that has this role. And as we've previously seen, so we talk about advice and consent, we were talking about the approval of presidential nominations, and approval is also called confirmation. So make sure that you always keep those things all linked together. Advice and consent, confirmation, approval, they're all talking about the same process for presidential nominations. And for the Senate to approve a presidential nomination, all that is required is a simple majority. And as we get into this in more detail here, you also need to understand that this is more important as a process for judicial nominees for federal judgeships, seats on the Supreme Court especially. It's more important for those judicial nominations than it is for executive appointments. And the reason for this is fairly straightforward. Executive appointments are the president's picks for leaders within the president's own branch of government. And in that sense, the Senate tends to be more deferential for who the president would like to pick to run parts of their own administration. On the other hand, nominations for members of the judicial branch are seen as more important because they are something that clearly impacts and shapes the policy outputs of a separate and co-equal branch of government. So there, traditionally, and just kind of this is thought about, the Senate should have much more scrutiny and much more say on which of those nominees will be able to take their positions in the federal courts or on the Supreme Court. We also need here to note an aside, and this will come up again when we talk about the executive branch, of course, and their nomination power, but I want to introduce it everywhere that it is relevant. And of course, this is the first time. We need to talk about something called senatorial courtesy. This is not anything that is written down. I mean, there have been people who have talked about changes in this tradition over time. And so there is a sort of paper trail in terms of precedent, but as it is practiced, it is an unwritten tradition. It's not in the Constitution, it's not in the amendment, it's not in any law. The tradition goes this way. The Senate will not confirm a judicial nominee if a senator of the president's party, and that is crucial to understand, hence why I've underlined it. It's not just any senator, but a senator who also belongs to the president's party, if they object to a district court nominee that is set to serve in that senator's state, or an appellate court nominee who is a resident of that senator's state. If the senator of the president's party objects to either of those types of nomination, then the Senate will not confirm. And the senator who's objecting really doesn't have a high bar. All they need to do is just explain the reason they think this person should not be confirmed. And historically, that has been enough to deny confirmation to that nominee. Now, I know at this point we don't know a whole lot about the difference between district and appellate courts. Don't worry about that. We are going to talk about the courts far more than most of you will want me to. Because of senatorial courtesy, and the reason we don't see a whole lot of actual failed nominations is that presidents tend to consult the relevant senators before they make a nomination. and will often consider suggestions that typically are sent to the president or members of the president's administration prior to a nomination. So there's a lot of input and back and forth before that nomination is made because of senatorial courtesy. Now, I don't want this to feel like a tacked on afterthought. We just don't have as much to say about it. Part of advice and consent is also the ratification of treaties. So most of the time, as I said, you need to think about advice and consent. Most often, that will be in the context of the approval or confirmation process. But it is also involved in the ratification of treaties. It's part of the Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution about the president's power to make treaties. As this is a power that is, both of these are not found in Article 1. Both of these are found in Article 2 of the Constitution. And that tells us that the Senate is required, or the Senate ratification is required before a treaty can go into effect. And the bar here is higher. Notice that for the confirmation process of nominees, a simple majority is all that is needed. And you can see that here in this image where Ketanji Brown Jackson, nominated by President Biden to fill a Supreme Court vacancy, was approved by a pretty narrow vote of 53 yay to 47 nay. Treaties, I'm supposed to go by that yet, treaties require a higher bar for ratification. And the reason for that is also pretty straightforward, although a lot of people probably aren't aware of this. Treaties that are entered into and ratified by the federal government kind of take precedent over all other U.S. laws, even to the point that something that might conflict with the Constitution, if it is in a treaty that the U.S. has made and ratified, that kind of trumps everything. And I don't want you to get too carried away. This does sometimes cause people to have overblown fears of treaties, but they are very important and they are very legally powerful, and so they require a 2/3 supermajority. And we have clear examples where there have been treaties that presidents dearly, dearly wanted that were rejected. After World War I, Woodrow Wilson, Democrat president at the time, was in conflict with Senate Republicans, and they refused to give him the votes needed to make a peace treaty, ratify a peace treaty with Germany to end the war. On the other hand, in 1945, the Senate ratifies the treaty that makes us a founding member of the United Nations. This is Harry Truman. At this time, he is the president of the United States. He had been vice president. Okay, so I want us to understand he's not in the Senate as the president of the Senate while he was vice president. At this point, he is president of the United States, right, and he is supervising the signing of that treaty that then becomes ratified by the Senate. I'm not going to quiz you about World War I, World War II, and the United Nations. I just want to give you some examples of failed and successful treaty ratification. Next up is the impeachment process. This can be used to remove executive and judicial officials. We mostly see this in the context of impeachment of presidents. And so a lot of times it's easy for students and pretty much everybody else to forget that impeachment is not just about presidents. It can be used to remove agency heads, federal judges, even Supreme Court justices could be subject to impeachment. We also need to be careful because what is always going to be kind of presented to you as impeachment should be thought of as an impeachment process. And the impeachment itself is only one step. Impeachment is when the House impeaches or charges an official with some kind of crime or wrongdoing that should be grounds, or that the House believes would be grounds to remove them from office. And this requires only a simple majority vote in the House to impeach, which is why, in this case, one of the impeachments of Donald Trump, you have a very narrow vote, 229 in favor, 195 opposed, and the impeachment was made, right? The charge was put against the president. From there, the next step is the trial in the Senate. And what the Senate is deciding is to convict or acquit the impeached official. But again, impeachment itself, the charge only happens in the House. Conviction requires a 2/3 supermajority. It's a much higher bar if we are going to remove someone from office, which is why there have been 3 presidential impeachments in my lifetime, 2 in yours, and none of them has resulted in a conviction because it requires that 2/3 supermajority. This scene is from the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And it was not even close to getting 2/3 of a supermajority. I do also want to be clear, when we talk about conviction or acquittal, the penalty if you're convicted is only removal from office. This doesn't mean we're sending anybody to prison, requiring them to pay fines, not even house arrest. It is only whether that person will remain in office or be removed from office. If the impeached official is the president, then the Supreme Court Chief Justice will preside over that trial. That I'm not sure how many people would ask you questions about that. I might quiz you over it at least once, just to be sure we know it at least at one time. But largely that's more of a matter of trivia kind of information. As you think about this, because a lot of students mix up the process or again confuse impeachment for being the whole thing, remember HIST. House impeaches, Senate tries. It runs in alphabetical order. If any part of that is not in the correct order, you need to step back and reconsider your thoughts. Right? House impeaches, Senate tries. Conveniently, also, each of the subsequent letters, right, H is followed directly by I in the alphabet, T follows S directly in the alphabet, so there's very much an alphabetical order going on for the whole thing and within each chamber. I'm not trying to turn this into an episode of Sesame Street, although maybe with the disbanding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, maybe somebody may need to pick up Sesame Street, but it should not be me. Now, for something completely different, proposal of amendments. And this is something we have seen before and seen already in some detail. But just as a reminder here, and it certainly fits, Congress is one of the ways that an amendment to the Constitution can be proposed. In this case, amendments to the Constitution are a very serious matter. And for Congress to propose an amendment, it requires a 2/3 supermajority in both houses, or in other words, as you see on the screen, a 2/3 bicameral supermajority. As we continue looking at non-legislative tasks of Congress, we're going to talk about one that really hasn't come up before, though it certainly is in the Constitution, or specifically here, amendments to it. We're going to talk about the electoral powers of Congress. And whereas advice and consent was something that was only in the Senate, this particular electoral power, electing a president, is something that is unique to the House. Again, this is in the 12th Amendment. This amendment and this practice came out of some early presidential elections where there was not a single candidate who got a majority. And most famously, this happened in 1824, in which either an electoral college tie, which is really what would happen now, where we have two major parties. But in 1824, you can see from the caption to this infographic, there were no distinct party designations. So for us, it would be a tie. In this case, nobody got close to having a majority. In that instance, the House of Representatives would elect the president. This would not be votes by individual members, so you're not trying to get a majority of 435 votes for president. It is a state-by-state vote. So regardless of how many members are in your state's congressional delegation or House delegation, each state only gets to cast one vote. And all you need is a simple majority to win. So you would need to get 26 states in order to win in the House. And of course, again, the most famous example of this is the election of 1824, when Adams and his supporters made a deal with Henry Clay, by which Clay's supporters would throw their weight to Adams, and Adams would become president instead of Jackson, even though Jackson in the initial election had significantly more electoral college votes. That was why it was called the corrupt bargain. Another electoral power is to elect the vice president. And this, throw this back here, this is only for the Senate. Now, if we're thinking about why does the House get to pick the president and the Senate gets to pick the vice president if necessary, remember, it's part of the same reason that the Speaker of House is second in the line of presidential succession and not someone from the Senate, even though the Senate is the upper house. The House is the only part of Congress that was always directly elected by the people, and it is up for election in its entirety every 2 years, so it is, in that sense, still closer to the people. So they get to pick the president. The Senate gets to pick the vice president if necessary. Both of these things, again, because of the 12th Amendment. And again, in case of an electoral college tie. And so partly also remember, initially you didn't have presidential tickets that included a president and vice president. The winner became president, the second became vice president. But if this happens, the Senate gets to decide, and the Senate vote individually, or senators vote individually. So here, you do need to get a majority of senators, so at least 51 in order to win. Whereas here, remember, it's state by state, and that can make things a little bit harder to remember. The Congress can also fill a vice presidential vacancy. This is as a result of the 25th Amendment. And this arose when Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, he was caught up in scandal and legal troubles and had to resign from the office of vice president. And now all of a sudden the office is empty. And so the 25th Amendment spells out what we're going to do in the case of such a vacancy. The president will nominate a replacement vice president, which kind of makes sense. Presidents get to pick their running mates when they're running for president. So the president nominates the new vice president, and then to confirm that person, you need a simple majority in the House and the Senate. Which again kind of muddies things up again. But in this case, it is both houses get to have a say, and you need a majority in both. This is how Gerald Ford became vice president. It's interesting, perhaps, if you ever get caught in a game of Trivial Pursuit. Gerald Ford is the only person to have become vice president and president without ever being elected to either of those jobs. He was a member of the House. He was the person Nixon picked after Spiro Agnew had to resign. Congress approved him, and he became vice president. Nixon then resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. And and Gerald Ford, as vice president, then stepped into the president role and lost his re-election bid to Democrat Jimmy Carter in 1976. So we've had the 25th Amendment also play out in real life, as well as the 12th. I'm now going to shift gears to a rather different non-legislative task of Congress, and that is oversight. And oversight is kind of what it sounds like. It's monitoring. It's monitoring, in this case, the executive branch, especially parts of the bureaucracy. And I know we haven't learned about a lot of that, and we definitely will. We will probably learn far more than you want to know about the federal bureaucracy. And what they're monitoring for is compliance with the law. Remember, what federal bureaucracies do, they're supposed to enforce laws, administer policies set legislatively by Congress. And so Congress, in their oversight function, they're making sure those bureaucracies are doing what laws, including what budgetary laws, tell them they're supposed to do. Are they spending the money the right way? So we can kind of put this in a more simple statement, or in this case, a question. Congress is basically asking in their oversight function, is the executive faithfully carrying out the policies we have set in law? And this is mostly done through committee hearings. And I know we're back to committees, which is most certainly not everybody's favorite topic. And committee hearings do not sound like exciting things, but they often capture a lot of media attention, and they can sometimes be quite interesting and revelatory. Some examples, and we'll pick examples of oversight of a Republican administration, and then a Democrat administration to keep things balanced out here. In 1987, the Iran-Contra affair. This is something I hope you were taught a bit about in U.S. history. We'll spare you a lot of the details, but here the issue is that the Central Intelligence Agency and the Department of Defense violated the law. There was the Boland Amendment. The federal government was not supposed to be supporting some armed rebels in Latin America, and they did. They also sold some weapons to Iran in a very convoluted arrangement, but long and the short of it is they violated the law. Congress held hearings. They helped propel this man, Oliver North, who was a lieutenant colonel. He was deputy National Security Council, or National Security Advisor. That part doesn't matter. Don't hold me to it if it's wrong. He had been responsible for a lot of the implementation of these arms sales and support deals. And as a result of this, it was very damaging to President Reagan's image, at least for a little while, and it was quite a big deal. So sometimes gets a lot of attention, but mixed accountability in terms of what actually happened. In the end, it was kind of concluded that Reagan couldn't be held directly responsible, directly connected to this. Oliver North lost his job, but mixed accountability. Another example, also related to conflict, 2014, Benghazi in Libya. There was an attack on a diplomatic mission, a U.S. diplomatic mission in Benghazi, and the question Congress was asking is, did the executive branch, especially State Department security agents, provide sufficient protection to that mission? There was a select committee that was created to deal with that. Most famously, it investigated Hillary Clinton's potential involvement, or as Republicans accused, malfeasance or at least negligence in dealing with that. The result of that was not really, conclusive, especially in terms of accountability. We also need to talk about the role of experts in the congressional staff for oversight. A lot of what the federal bureaucracy does today is incredibly specialized and requires a lot of expert knowledge in order to even be able to determine whether the bureaucracy is complying with legislative policies legislatively set by Congress. And so expert congressional staff have a huge role in this, reading reports that Congress requires the bureaucracies to submit, talking with their counterparts in the federal bureaucracy. So expertise is very important to this. And if it sounds like most of this is, it's just talk, it's just reports, it isn't. And where things can get interesting is when we start talking about the role of money. So what Congress really has to use as leverage is money, either money as a carrot or money as a stick. It can offer bureaucracies a larger budget. Bureaucracies tend to want their budgets to increase, and they certainly don't want them to be cut, and that is the stick. Congress can threaten to cut funding from a bureaucratic agency that is not doing what Congress has instructed it to do through the law. There are limitations, and they might not be the ones that you think. Congress has plenty of expertise, either through its own membership or, again, through those expert congressional staff to monitor the bureaucracy. The limitations are something different. One problem is simply that because there are so many committees and subcommittees, and so often they deal with the same kinds of things, you have fragmented or overlapping jurisdictions. And so it's not either you have lots of committees holding the same kinds of hearings, or it's not clear who should be holding the hearings, and that can make it difficult for Congress to ask clear questions and get clear answers, and present that information as when they want to present that information to the public in a coherent way. Party politics is also a limitation. Right now, you're not going to see a whole lot of intense congressional oversight hearings because Republicans control the House and the Senate, and the President of the United States is a Republican. When you have unified government, meaning one party controls Congress and the presidency, you tend not to get hearings. And certainly not major hearings that are meant to uncover things and rock the boat. If Republicans suffer serious losses in the midterms in 2026, you can expect that there will be lots of oversight hearings after that. One thing I do need to point out, though, is you still, even as partisan as things have gotten in the United States, it is still very difficult to have effective oversight unless the majority party can get at least some buy-in from the minority. So in this case, if it were Republicans wanting to hold oversight hearings, they wanted those to be effective. They would still need to get some Democrats. Otherwise, and this is usually what will happen if you don't have bipartisan support, is the other party will simply say that these oversight committees are just a farce. They're just a partisan witch hunt. The minority party has no involvement, no say in the investigations, and so whatever the committee produces can't be believed, isn't credible. Perhaps the most important limitation, however, is simply this, that there's often not much incentive for members to be interested in holding the bureaucracy to account. When you need experts to understand things, when you have lots of arcane stuff, lots of arcane things for Congress to monitor, the public either doesn't understand or doesn't care about these things, or both. And if the public doesn't know and the public doesn't care, members of Congress don't have a lot of incentive to try and figure it out either. And especially because the bureaucracy has gotten so large, unless members have a clear reason to be doing oversight, we often simply just don't get it. And so that's perhaps the biggest limitation on oversight. That is where we were going to stop with Lecture 3. When we come back, you can see we'll be talking about congressional elections.